Hi, so I'm Jill Sutherland and I've been the Curatorial Fellow at the Holborn Museum from October 2019 to April 2021. And I'm recording this video to talk about the redisplay of the Plantation Daybook in the Fletcher Gallery, which is something that I've been working on pretty much since the beginning when I started in October 2019. Many sort of volunteers and staff members were involved in this redisplay, from early conversations to the volunteers kindly carrying out visitor surveys and observation tasks, which is all sort of fed into a wider interpretation document that the museum now has. But that work and those conversations and interactions also fed into this redisplay. As part of my fellowship, my main job was to review the interpretation at the Holborn Museum, but the second sort of strand of my job was to implement a change. So change one of the displays, rehouse something, make a physical change. So I'm going to talk you through how I ended up changing the display of the Plantation book. Just allow me to share my screen. So there we are, our museum, the Holborn Museum. And here is the Fletcher Gallery. So it was on an initial sort of walk around that I did, just looking at how things are currently displayed, how our interpretation is currently written, and I was just sort of observing, basically. And then in the Fletcher Gallery, I was having a look at these displays, the tea memorabilia, and I noticed the drawers. So as you all know, the gallery, the Fletcher Gallery, is themed around arts and elegance in Georgian Bath. So it's all about luxury, taste, consumption, fashions, I suppose, in terms of consumerism. And it does talk about sort of imports and exports from other countries. And yeah, but one of the questions is really, I think, about this that hasn't been addressed fully or in great detail until now is, how were these things made possible? How did Britain end up with these things? How did the museum end up with these things? And how was Georgian society able, facilitated to enjoy the arts and elegance that was around? Now that image on the bottom left, which is currently on display, sort of gives you a clue as to how it was all made possible. So the yellow circle at the bottom right there is the drawer that this book is in. It's entitled Sugar and Slavery. So that's the current display. And the book is laid flat and it's on top of an image of it's the Brooks diagram, which shows an illustration of slaves kind of crammed into a ship and what it would have looked like. And it's kind of ironic because the book itself is squashed into a case that doesn't really fit. So it's in an acrylic holder at the moment, which is quite sort of poorly suited to it. It's kind of squashing it. And I just think when I saw this, I had a lot of reactions, a lot of emotions, I suppose, when I saw it. My first reaction was shock and intrigue. I mean, I was sort of shocked to see that this was the display in that gallery that was addressing slavery and the origins of the wealth and objects in that gallery. And I was intrigued about what this book was, because it doesn't really tell you. The current interpretation does say that it's a daybook for a sugar plantation on the island of Barbados. William Holborn's great-grandfather, Guy Ball, owned several sugar plantations. And that's it. Doesn't tell you anything about the book itself. And yeah, it felt odd, felt really odd, and it felt very hidden. And I don't know how purposeful that was or not. But yeah, I sort of saw this object and I thought, well, this needs to come out. We need to sort of look at this a bit more. And I think the way that it's currently displayed is quite a good example of a kind of silencing and a kind of neglect when it comes to stories about and histories in our museums about slavery and how habits and wealth were formed in the 17th, 18th centuries. This in particular, I think, is a good example of a lack of care in terms of the object itself. So obviously, as a museum, it's our responsibility to take care of the objects that we have. And this one, as I said, is sort of quite poorly crammed into an acrylic case. The object is also, you know, hierarchically much lower down than the other things. So it's, you know, a visual prioritization there, a visual hierarchy, and also a kind of psychological hierarchy of putting these beautiful objects, these wonderful things that came out of something quite tragic and an atrocity, putting that and appreciating how beautiful and tasteful it all is above the fact that, I mean, what this book represents, which is millions of people died, millions of people were enslaved, tortured, treated as less than human, viewed as less than human, so that things like that could be enjoyed in Britain and Europe. So yeah, also it's not just object care neglect, it's visitor neglect in my view. So for a visitor like me, for example, running around, just having a little look, enjoying my time at the museum, then I stumble upon this drawer and open it, and I just kind of, you know, I think it's important to maybe for you to think about how something like that might make somebody like me feel walking around. So, I mean, my ancestry, my heritage, in case it's not clear, is Indian Caribbean. So my family is from an island in the Caribbean called St. Vincent. And my parents came over to the UK in the 70s, alongside many other people from the Caribbean and other colonized countries. So yeah, that's just a brief bit about me, but yeah, so I'm not white. So for somebody like me, a person of color, to sort of come in and see this, I just sort of would like to prompt you to think about how somebody like me might feel and how other visitors like me might feel when they see something like this. And you know, I have sort of heard before people say, you know, well, what's slavery got to do with the Holbein Museum? What has race got to do with the Holbein Museum? You know, well, this book sort of lays it all bare, I would say. Why do we have this in our collection? Well, it was owned by William Holbein's great-grandfather. And yeah, I think it's important as well for me to add that when people say slavery is in the past and it's something that we don't need to really worry about or think about now anymore, there's a couple of things I'd like to sort of put to you and say to you in response. So the first one is, we're a museum. We deal with historic objects, and our business is, if you like, in the past, in dealing with the past. So that's number one. Number two, we think about like 1940s and 50s Britain. There was a colour bar in place. So, you know, white people and black people were separated. There were certain opportunities and freedoms that black people weren't permitted to have. People of colour were told to go back to their countries. And my parents, even in the 70s, faced this prejudice. You know, but why were these people here? And why are these people here? And by these people, I mean people like me. Why were we all here? Why are we here? Well, former colonized countries is why. You know, slavery is at the root of this. Slavery is at the root of the migration of people to Britain, which is part of all of our histories. And I don't know if some of you might remember sort of going through, witnessing racial prejudice in your younger years, maybe when you were a kid, when you were a teenager, but I mean, I certainly did. And you know, I was born in '85, so those sorts of prejudices and that racism that persists today came from slavery. So it's not in the past. It's very much something that has impacted the way we see people, the way we see each other, the way we understand ourselves. And you know, it impacts my life daily. So slavery is not in the past. It has the legacy, for want of a better word, because legacy I think implies something positive, and it's not. The consequences, the impact continues today. And the third thing I want to add there is, if you were a black or a brown person right here, right now, you know, would you feel differently? Because your experiences of museums would most certainly be very, very different. So anywho, yeah, that's my response to slavery in the past. Going back to the object, as you can see, the pages have been cut out. Now, why they've been cut, who did it, when it happened, we don't know. So that's two like really fascinating things about this object. I mean, I think for a lot of people, it could be a very boring looking, it's just a flat, boring looking book. You know, there's nothing exciting about it, there's nothing beautiful about it. But, you know, symbolically, the fact that these pages are gone and how brutally they've been cut out as well, it's not even done very neatly. You know, that I think that is extremely symbolic and poignant when we think about what kinds of stories and histories and representations we see in our museums in Britain and in the Holborn. So as you can see, there's only one page that remains, which just has some products listed on there. And as the interpretation currently is, it doesn't explain that books like this would have had produce, exports and imports, things coming in and out. It was used as an accounting tool, this book. But books like this would have also had names of people. They would have had the names of enslaved people on these plantations, obviously given names, not true names. Lots of people sort of were born on these plantations, died there, were bought and sold. And this transactional nature and treatment of people is, you know, it's very powerful to think about, and it's really disturbing when you think about just you know, a beautiful teacup. What went into people being able to enjoy those things. And yeah, this sort of the fact that the pages are missing also, I think, represents a silence, the absence of these things. And I think there's been a long-serving denial and physical absence of truth, of the truth that our first public museums were founded in the 17th and 18th centuries, and that they were built on the premise that white skin is superior to black bodies. And British masses were educated in this hierarchy of culture and civility through public displays that celebrated Britain's power and dominance over the world. So how can we, as museum professionals, museum volunteers, essentially working in the business of history, how can we continue to deny those origins and the consequences of those origins on how Britain sees itself now, on how people of colour see ourselves in this country, whether we're born here or not? You know, how Britain celebrates its past and appreciates the ethnicities that are here and part of British culture as a result. How can we move on, move forward, progress with these things? Just some, you know, few very minor questions to put out to you there. Yeah, quite big questions, I suppose. So this is where the display is going to go. It's in the on the panels in front of the air conditioning units in the Fletcher. Now, I think it's quite interesting that that is where it's going. It sort of has to go there. It's the only sort of place for it, really. But what is going to happen is it will be put in its own case. And this case is quite big. It's got a bit of room, so it's no longer sort of squashed in. Yes. Where's my place? Right, so this is, so yeah, these are the panels that are there at the moment, and they show illustrations, satirical drawings of, you know, sort of fun, poking fun at fashion and the consumer society at the time. That's going, that's, you know, that is going to be gone. And this is what it will be replaced with. So as I said, the book is going to have its own case, and the backdrop will have sort of three elements, really, I would say, or maybe four if we include the plinth. So the first panel is going to look at the Holborn family and the Caribbean, so Caribbean plantations. Second panel will, the case will sit in front of that, and there's a map of Barbados there from 1600s, which shows how the country was chopped up into plantations. So you can see, you know, just how affected the country was, just how colonized it was. And then, excuse me, the plinth will feature some things that I'll talk about in a moment. And then the last two panels will show portraits of black and white individuals from Bath and Somerset, or associated with, or who visited Bath and Somerset during Georgian and Victorian times, who were involved in anti-slavery campaigning, or enacted sort of a form of black agency by not going along with what they're expected to be doing at that time. So there's a few reasons for why these are the elements of the display. And a lot of it, as I said, was designed and came out of talking to people at the museum, staff, volunteers, trustees, and I also spoke to people outside of the museum. So I spoke to some students from Bath Uni, Bath Spa, Bristol, and various groups, really, of individuals. So it wasn't just a white audience that I spoke to. I spoke to students of colour as well. But one of the things that staff and volunteers in particular wanted to see in terms of our overall offer was a bit more about Holborn's family history. So that's partly why this is going to be explored here. It might not be the exact family history that you were hoping for, but it is some family history, and it engages with three main families, basically. So it shows how the Holborn family were linked to the slave trade through three sort of main families and three countries. So the Lascelles family, the Ball family, and the cousins, and then Jamaica, Barbados, and Antigua. Obviously, you'll learn more about these connections when you have a look at the new display. But I can just briefly tell you that Frances Holborn, Frances Ball, the daughter of Guy Ball, so William's grandmother, she is sort of the main link, I suppose, to all of these families. So Frances Ball was married to A. Lascelles, Edward Lascelles, first off. And then when that marriage was over, when Lascelles passed away, she then married Admiral Holborn, William's grandfather. And then the cousins family, who had properties and plantations in Jamaica, it was Catherine Cousins, William's aunt, who was married into the cousins family, and that's how William Holborn got his wealth. So just kind of in a nutshell, but there's a lot of sort of history to think about and go into there, which is on the display. And then obviously, because the book's from Barbados, we were very lucky, I feel, to have worked with Barbados Museum, who have collaborated with me on this display a bit. So what's happened is they've contributed some interpretation. So they have a small section of text which is going to go on to one of the panels and also has fed into some of the overall interpretation text. And then that document on the left is an original mortgage deed from the Balls Plantation. So the Balls Plantation is in Christchurch in Barbados. And while they don't have any documents from 1722, they do have a document from the plantation, which is from a century later, so 1834. And on this deed, it shows some of the names of the enslaved people on the plantation at the time. And so what we're going to do as a sign of respect and to honour, symbolically honour those pages that are missing and essentially the names and histories that are missing from our book, we are replicating some of those enslaved names on the plinth of the book. We've also been working with the artist Alberta Whittle, so that is a lovely connection that was made through Will, who is planning some work with Alberta, I think at the museum in a couple of years' time. And I had a lovely meeting with Alberta. She was really nice, and she's actually from Barbados, but she is based in Glasgow now. She sort of goes between the two places. And she has agreed, well, she's written it now, on the front of the plinth, she's produced a poetic epitaph. And again, that is to memorialize an aspect of the display. So then the last two panels are, as I've mentioned, this is the theme, anti-slavery and colonial resistance in Bath and Somerset. Now, why have we gone for this? There's several reasons, really. One of the reasons is, you know, to bring this object to life, it involves engaging and understanding with the people aspect, the people that were involved in whatever way. And we don't have many sort of portraits, we don't have many images of people in the Posnet or Fletcher, unless they're sort of those Dutch portraits in the bottom. So it's a nice way of sort of seeing people around these objects. Secondly, I think sometimes it's been said that slavery at the time, you know, it was just how things were. It was just a thing at the time. And, you know, we shouldn't put modern standards on what happened in the past. Well, yes, it was a different time period, but it wasn't just a thing of the time. You know, people were extremely unhappy about what was going on. The people enslaved on the plantations in the Caribbean regularly rebelled and, you know, were anti what was happening to them. And it wasn't just there, it was also across Europe and in Britain, people were rejecting slavery and what was going on. So it wasn't something that was just accepted and people were just fine to get on with. There were a lot of people who were really, really anti-slavery, as we would be and as we are today. And so I wanted to dispel that myth by showing that these people were against it from the beginning, you know. And I don't know, for some people that might be a surprise, but it's true. And then another thing is to show that it wasn't just Wilberforce, it wasn't just William Wilberforce, it wasn't just a brigade of white saviours who decided to end slavery or campaign against it. It was black and white individuals. So that's why we have black and white individuals in this display. and men and women as well. So at the top left, we've got William and Ellen Craft. They were enslaved in, I can't remember, Mississippi. Oh my God, I'm not sure. They were enslaved in America, and they managed to escape. It's such a wonderful story, and I won't go into detail about it here, but it's a fascinating, like very daring and bold, fantastic story. And yeah, so they actually did speak in Bath and have links to Bath. Then in the middle, at the top, we've got Catherine Impey. So she was a Quaker from Street in Somerset. She hosted people from all over the world at her house. And she published a pamphlet called Anti-Caste, and it was Britain's first anti-slavery publication. Then next to her, I.W. Wells. So she's American, African-American, and she became most famous for her anti-lynching campaigning. Then we've got Ignatius Sancho, George Bridgetower, and Ira Aldridge in the middle, that three. And then at the bottom, Kathleen Turner, Josiah Wedgwood, and Harold Moody. So the middle three all sort of, although Ignatius Sancho did campaign, he was an abolitionist. He was sort of famous for other reasons. He was a prominent cultural figure, should we say. He was a playwright and writer. George Bridgetower in the middle was a musician. He was a violinist. And Ira Aldridge, as you all know, was an actor, the first Black actor to play Othello, and obviously performed in Bath. The Holborn Museum had his portrait up for a while. And interestingly, from the visitor survey that we did in February 2020, the Ira Aldridge display was the most popular in that room. So for anyone who sort of had any doubt about whether people liked that or not, they really did. The visitors really did like that. Bottom left, Lady Kathleen. She was an Irish anti-slavery campaigner. Wedgwood, you know about, and then Harold Moody is actually, he was born in the post-emancipation years, so that's after 1834, and I thought it was important to include him to show how these things really did carry across into the 20th century, and still continue, as I mentioned earlier. His work was integral to sort of dispelling the myths about why a colour bar should be in place. There's a lot to sort of think about. There's a lot to take in with this display, and if we have a look at the main overall image of it, you can see there's a lot of text, which is something that we don't have. There's nothing else like this at the museum. And I would say to that a few things, really. It's not the sort of history, it's not the sort of stories that you can just look at and give a one-liner about. They're very, very deep. They're very rich histories. So it's not the sort of thing that we can just say, this cup was made in this factory. It's a great example of the time. There needs to be more said, so it deserves that explanation. And from the sounds of it, visitors would enjoy having that information. I also think that maybe it's something that you can go away and come back to. So you might not be able to read it all in one go, even though I know that some visitors do read everything all in one go. So from that, in that respect, having something that you can kind of learn something new every time you look at it could be a nice way to think about it. And yeah, I think it's ultimately really about respect, giving this narrative, it's not a narrative, it's the truth, and giving this sort of different, what's the way, this departure from the rest of the gallery. It's a departure. from celebrating and glorifying Georgian life. And it's a bit of a dose of reality. So yeah, I think it deserves that space. And I included this because I just sort of wanted to give you something else to think about. So this lady, she's a Maori scholar based in New Zealand. And her thing is Indigenous knowledge and recovering our sense of knowledge and identity post-colonialism. And I was watching a talk of hers, and the background there is eggshells. And I just think this is a really interesting and powerful thing to share with you. So she said, she showed this image in her talk, and she said, if you didn't know the shape of an egg, how would you put those back together again? So that's the image I want you to have of what it means for me and others to talk about our knowledge after colonialism. And I just think that that is, that's a fantastic way to sort of try and get across to you, if you haven't thought about it before, how demand for these sorts of things in our museums is not coming from a place of, it's coming from a place of neglect and oppression, and showing these sorts of stories in museums as a way of recovering things that have been lost, recovering things that have been silenced, recovering our sense of selves and our understanding of each other and of British history. You know, I think it's about time that we realise British history is not just about monarchs, famous painters, aristocratic figures, and white war veterans. There are things to feel proud of, perhaps more things, more people, and also that there are other things that we shouldn't forget. And these include atrocities committed by the British and the colonial regime of empire that was inflicted on other countries during the 17th to 19th centuries. One of the things I think would be important to talk about with you before I finish is fear and shame. So I think one of the reasons, or one of the hesitancies around talking about issues of race or Black history or colonial history is a fear of getting things wrong, of saying the wrong thing, of causing offence to other white visitors, so our core visitors, if you like. But what about causing offence to visitors of colour or visitors not from the UK? I mean, there's also a sense of shame in questioning something that you've never had to before. You know, realising things you never knew and feeling like you should know. There's definitely fear in change as well. But, you know, people of colour in Britain also have fear and shame. We're afraid to be ourselves. You know, we don't want to be called angry or too loud. We fear the backlash of demanding a seat at the table, which is something that, you know, we have a right to. And we are encouraged by white-centered narratives and displays in museums to feel shame rather than pride in who we are. I mean, I don't want to make everything about race, and people of colour don't only want to talk about slavery as formative to our identities. We are more, but Britain has stifled our exploration of ourselves, and it's stifled white understanding of us, or sharing history in this country. I mean, I don't really think museums have been encouraged to question and think about this in any real depth until maybe right now, until this moment now, which is why it's kind of exciting in a way. It's a good time to be opening up these conversations and thinking about it. And really, another thing I need to say is what have you got to lose? So the only thing that's going to be lost is exclusive rights, exclusivity, you know, rights to historical pride. when we think about telling these stories. Museums are traditionally exclusive, they're predominantly white spaces. Exclusivity is what will change, not your rights to culture, not your rights to historical pride or your access to spaces. It's about opening those rights to include others and not taking something away from you per se. And I would say that these stories like this display, if racial inequality was no longer an issue in Britain, we wouldn't really be talking about it. Then we wouldn't need to talk about it, and then we could say very gladly, it's in the past. So maybe you need to think about, well, it would be great if you could think about why it's so important to other people. You know, it's not coming from an aggressive or a threatening place, it's coming from a place of oppression, exclusion, and denial of identity, existence even. You know, this book, Hidden, that's a denial. Yeah. So I'm aware that I'm probably going on for a bit now. So I will finish by saying that there are 3 key themes, and this is what I think would be good to channel and think about when we're interacting with visitors around this display. So the first theme is acceptance, and I put confidence in brackets because I mean acceptance that the Holbein family were involved with the slave trade. It's true, and we have the information there. And I really hope that we can all sort of look at it and think about that with confidence. And I don't mean confidence as in we're proud of it. Confidence as in we can accept that they were connected. It's not a hidden truth. It's nothing to be ashamed of. It's a fact. It's the truth, basically. The second theme is remembrance. And really, in brackets, that's respect. So if we think about how other histories, such as the Holocaust or, you know, remembrance for war narratives in our museums, how sort of, how meaningful they are to people and how respectful they are. Well, slavery and the impact of slavery hasn't been given that level of respect traditionally in our museums. So hence the epitaph, hence the reproduced names on the plinth, the working with Barbados Museum where that plantation was. Like, it's all a way to be respectful about this history. And then the third theme, I hope, I would like it to be empowerment. I hope that it's empowering to know and learn and realise that there's been a history of resistance to this kind of prejudice. And it's not just a Black problem. You know, Black and white people were resisting from very early on. And I feel like that is something that we can also collectively be proud of. I think it's a way of bringing us together, uniting us, rather than sort of separating white elites from enslaved Black people, which is not how life is anymore or should be. So yeah, I hope that it empowers visitors and staff and volunteers. I think, yes, that's the end. So thank you for listening, and I hope that you enjoy seeing the final display. I hope that you've been prompted to think about some different things and that you feel good about this display. And yes, I wish the Holbein luck with things going forward. And yes, thank you all very much for your participation in the project, your interest and your ideas. And I hope that some of it has addressed some of the things that you raised. So yeah, I'll leave it there. Thanks, bye.